שלום וברוכים הבאים, אני שירן רז, ומי שחדש בערוץ, אז אני אספר לכם שתמצאו פה נושאים גיאופוליטיקה על המערב, דתות, מזרח התיכון, וכמובן עם ההקשרים למדינת ישראל. אני עושה מאמצים אדירים להביא קולות ייחודיים, להביא זוויות שאנחנו לא שומעים בדרך כלל בתקשורת המיינסטרים, ובכלל בתקשורת בארץ. האורח שלי היום הוא דאגלס קרסוול, והוא פוליטיקאי לשעבר אנגלי, והוא מביא לנו זווית מאוד מעניינת על מה שקורה היום עם המהגרים, מה שקורה במערב, וכמובן שאלה אחת גדולה ששמתי אותה על השולחן. האם ישראל היום נמצאת בקו החזית מול האסלאם, ובעצם היא זו שמגינה לבדה על המערב. בואו תצללו ביחד איתי לרעיון, וכמובן יש לנו גם מועדון חברים, אז אם אתם רוצים להיכנס ולזכות בתכנים ייחודיים, זה הזמן להצטרף, ומי שאוהב רק לדבר ולהתעדכן בכל מיני חדשות ואקטואליה שעתית בערך, אז יש לנו ערוץ טלגרם שאתם יכולים להיות גם שם. קדימה, תצטרפו אליי, אני אפגוש אתכם בסוף הפרק. Hello Douglas, I'm so excited to have you on my channel.
Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here.
My audience are mostly Jewish and Israeli, so maybe it's the first time they will hear about you and your thoughts and your perspective about England, the West, Middle East. I think before we will dive in, you will introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Douglas Carswell. I was the Member of Parliament for the Conservatives in Britain. I went into politics in Britain to try to get Britain out of the European Union. So my main reason for being in politics in Britain was what today we call Brexit. I co-founded the official Brexit campaign and switched parties to do that. But I now live in America. I moved to America 5 years ago. And I live, as you can see from the sign behind me, I live here in Mississippi, the poorest state in America. The per capita GDP of Mississippi has recently overtaken that of the UK. So although Mississippi is relatively poor compared to other American states, it's actually doing rather well. So my job now is to try to extend economic freedom and liberty and free market forces here in the South. And I love my job. I prefer being in public policy than politics, but I still have a great interest back in the old country.
I know Mississippi only from old movies, and this is my only connection to this city. But anyhow, so let's go back to the Brexit vote, the moment that England decided to leave EU. And if I understood right, you were in favor of it. So it's interesting me what were your concerns back then and what were your reasons, and if today you think it was a good decision.
I was in favor of and am in favor of Britain leaving the European Union for the same reason that I'm pro-Israel. I believe in national self-determination. You know, for 2,000 years, Jewish families exiled would say, and next year in Jerusalem. And then it came to pass almost miraculously in 1946, 1947. Israel came into existence, national self-determination. I think national self-determination is the optimal way to organize human societies. It's good for countries, and it's good for people to have their countries, the nation state. Britain left the European Union, and it's true, Britain hasn't fully taken advantage of the opportunities of Brexit. Often the officials, the administrative elite, the permanent civil servants in Britain who were very opposed to Brexit at the time, they are still running the country, and they've made sure that Britain remains aligned to Europe. But I think anyone looking at Europe today would recognize that Europe is sinking, and sinking fast. It is an economic backwater. Europe has failed to produce any significant economic or technological innovation. And I think it's a consequence of how Europe is organized. It is organized by a remote, bureaucratic, technocratic, left-wing, anti-nation state elite. And it is a catastrophe. It is a disaster. It is Europe's version of the Ottoman Empire. It is not good for Europeans. It is a disastrous way for 500 million Europeans to have their lives organized for them.
You just mentioned it, and I heard it in another interview you had, You mentioned the elite, which probably they are the one who controlling and operate in England. And it's really interesting for me to understand what you mean by elite. Who is behind them? What kind of power they have? And if the citizen in England and maybe even in Europe agree with them, or there is a big gap.
We all, don't we? Whether you're in a democracy like Israel with a essentially parliamentary system like in England, or whether you're in a democracy in Western Europe or in America, we all love this idea that we decide how we're governed and every person has a vote and we exercise that and we choose a government. The problem, I think, is that certainly in Britain and America, but particularly in Britain and in Europe, the system of democracy has sort of been subverted by creating a permanent class of officials. This means that you can elect a government that, for example, promises to clamp down on immigration. And yet what actually happens is that the officials and the judges, I include judges in this, prevent what the people voted for and what elected officials want to happen from happening. And we see this again and again. And in America, the shorthand expression for this permanent elite is the administrative state. Often people in America will talk about the administrative state. Trump will rail against the administrative state. In fact, I would say one of the reasons why Trump was re-elected was because he stood against the administrative state, this permanent entrenched bureaucracy. In Britain, the administrative state and the judiciary is essentially running the country and is running it into the ground. They're preventing the country from making the changes it needs to on immigration. It prevents the country from enforcing control of its borders. But the administrative state, the permanent officials, have also rendered the United Kingdom financially very weak because they insist upon spending and borrowing. The administrative state, the elite, have ruined Britain's defense procurement, for example. Britain spends many times more on defense procurement than Israel, but doesn't pack nearly as effective a punch as Israel. Again, because you've got this permanently entrenched, essentially parasitic bureaucracy that is destroying the country. And I think when you talk about populism in Britain and America and Europe, you're seeing essentially a reaction from the ordinary voters against this entrenched bureaucracy. So I think a lot of what people dismiss as populism is actually a necessary corrective. The key issue is, will we manage in the West to renew our countries by getting rid of this old elite, or will they take our civilization the way of many other civilizations that were governed by parasitic elites? Are we going to end up like the Byzantines, governed by an essentially self-serving clique that reduce our civilization? I think it's decision time.
But do you think it's possible to take the elite out, because it's the same issue we are handling here in Israel also?
I think it's absolutely essential you do. I mean, I know there are issues in Israel to do with the accountability of judges, and I don't want to go there because, but I will talk from a British perspective. In the United Kingdom today, we have seen a process of judicial aggrandizement. By this, I mean, judges have stopped interpreting the law as it is written, as Parliament intended it, as the Knesset intended it, you might say. And they're interpreting the law as they wish it to be. Now, often they will justify this by saying, we, the judges, have to safeguard certain principles, human rights in Britain they talk about. Where were these judges safeguarding my human rights when the British state insisted that I was put under house arrest because of COVID? Where were the judges insisting upon enforcing the laws and upholding the laws on immigration when it comes to removing people? The judicial activism that you see in Britain only tilts one way. It is only in a left-wing, anti-nation state, pro-supranational direction. And it is essentially self-destructive. Judicial activism has prevented Britain from controlling its borders. It's prevented Britain.
I agree. I totally agree with what you are saying. Sorry, I disrupt you. Did you finish your sentence?
No.
Yeah.
But I think it's becoming an existential question for Britain in particular. 1 in 10 people living in Britain has arrived in the country, usually from culturally incompatible countries. 1 in 10 people in Britain today has arrived in the past 5 years. We're not able to limit the number of people coming in. In fact, only 2 days ago, a British judge has given permission for a nephew of a Taliban commander from Afghanistan, currently living in Turkey, not even in Britain, living in Turkey, to come with his family to the United Kingdom. This is a form of insanity.
But what kind of explanation they are giving? Human rights, what? Or they don't give any explanation?
I mean, they rationalize it in all sorts of ways, but they're essentially meaningless. The root cause of the problem, and I think we need to be clear about this, is that philosophically, the people pushing this open border agenda basically believe in cultural relativism. They believe that all people are essentially the same, and that you can take someone from Eritrea or Afghanistan, bring them to Britain, and a few weeks later they'll be playing cricket, eating cucumber sandwiches and applauding the king. People who know anything about the world know that that is a nonsense. People and cultures are very, very different. I myself remember very clearly going to Israel and standing on the border, and on one side of the border I saw a country that essentially looked like civilization in Melbourne or England or America, and on the other side of the boundary a culture and a country that was essentially third world. These are profound and fundamental differences between the Western way of life and the non-Western way of life. I mean, I think if you want to get philosophical about it, I think a lot of it probably stems from the Judeo-Christian idea that each person is made in the image of God. This is a very, I believe, a Jewish theocratic insight.
Totally.
And it informs the concept of Western individualism. And not all societies have this. But if you are a left-wing activist in the judiciary or a left-wing activist in the tribunal and immigration system in Britain, you naively and foolishly and stupidly believe that people are interchangeable. And you allow large numbers of people who are not compatible with the Western way of life into the West. And it is a disaster. It is a catastrophe. It needs to stop.
You know, I think it's led me in my mind to one of Israel's mistake in the beginning of this war on October 7th. Israel separate Hamas from Gazan citizen. She said Hamas is a completely different terror organization and there are the citizen. But if you just have a little bit brain, you can understand that they are the same. You know, Gaza is like 45 kilometers square, and the tunnel they were built beneath the ground, something like 500 kilometers. Who built them? Only the Hamas? Who helped them? Who took all the supplies inside the tunnel? Who were celebrated? Who helped them to kidnap, to slaughter, to kill, to murder on October 7th, and all those decades.
I mean, long before October the 7th, I had a prejudice.
Exactly. It was ongoing terror with rockets and with murdering and getting into the border and knifing and stabbing and whatever you want. They're very creative in killing.
I've long had a bias in favor of Israel, and the reason I've had a bias in favor of Israel is actually in a weird way. My very first memory, literally my very first memory, I think I was 6 years old at the time, was a memory of Israel. The reason for that, why would a British person have a memory of Israel? Because at the time I happened to be living with my family in a small country in the middle of Africa called Uganda. We lived just outside Entebbe, and my very first memory was the morning of the Entebbe raid, when these people called the Israelis came in airplanes and they freed the hostages and they defeated the bad guy, Amin. Sadly, they didn't actually finish him, but the good guys won. And as a 6-year-old child, I remember this very clearly. It was a very vivid memory for me.
Yeah.
And ever since then, I've always had a soft spot for Israel. I've always known that they are the good guys.
Yeah.
I wasn't prepared quite for what happened in the aftermath of October the 7th. I was truly appalled how before the dead had even been identified, there were people in the West protesting, students at so-called elite universities protesting in favor of the perpetrators of that. Okay. And I think that is a wake-up call. That is a wake-up call for the West. It's a wake-up call for the world. You know, pick a side. Are you on the side of people who believe in freedom and liberty and democracy, or are you going to support an essentially Islamo-fascist gang? And you're right. As a new member of parliament, I remember very clearly, I think I was just about to become a member of parliament. I remember the argument in Britain, and it was one I shared at the time, that if Israel removed some of their settlers from Gaza, they would get a lasting peace. And I remember watching endless news broadcasts from the BBC saying, you know, and it was a traumatic scene because they were famously, I remember Israeli soldiers having to go in and literally drag this Jewish family out of their home and say, you've got to leave Gaza. And there were, you know, but I remember thinking, this is good because, you know, Israel's going to be on that side. The Palestinians will be on that side.
To get separate from them and everyone have a good life and in peace. But it was
and they used the intervening decade and a half to plot October the 7th. I mean, that you can't reason with that. You can't negotiate with that. You can't do a deal with that. I mean, it's a, you know, rather than using the resources that poured in from the European Union and the UN to build a better life, they used it to create terror dungeons. I mean, it's bizarre. It's you know, it cannot be reasoned with.
It's a barbarian culture, and all of them like this, because the moment they are coming to this world by it's not education, but everything they are teaching them in schools and kindergarten and in family, in mosques, and the lecture the imam is giving in all kind of holy places. All the environment is full with death and terror. Yeah. And this is why it's impossible to grow up differently. I don't think they were born murderer. I think this is how they educated them. But this is the results. And this is what really surprised me on October 7th, that it took the West 48 hours to support us, and then they completely changed. What do you think motivated the young youth against Israel? Most of them doesn't even know where are the sea and where are the river.
I mean, I think one of the factors that we need to look into, and there's not been, I haven't seen the research, but I think research needs to be done, is the extent to which some of those elite universities like Oxford and Cambridge in Britain and some of the elite London colleges, but particularly some of the Ivy League colleges in America, to what extent some of the protesters were actually from non-Western backgrounds. I think a significant number of protesters in America tended to be people who recent arrivals from the Middle East. And I think that we need to look into that and identify that and be clear about that. Because if that is the case, then I think it raises some fairly elemental questions about the way we accommodate and offer generosity and hospitality to people from those backgrounds. If you're going to come and accept a scholarship to an elite university in the West and then indulge in essentially a sort of form of a pre-modern tribalism, you may be better off studying somewhere else. Undoubtedly, though, there are a certain number of in the UK and America, white liberals who have an animus towards Israel.
Yeah.
Now, I suspect some of it is because they're left-wing, and left-wing people don't like Israel. And one of the reasons why left-wing people don't like Israel is because Israel is the embodiment of national self-determination.
Yes.
Israel's success is a repudiation of all that supranationalist nonsense that they believe in. And it's an affront for much the same reason, I might say that these left-wingers are often anti-American, because America is a wonderful expression of national self-determination. I think there may be a smattering of anti-Semitism. I'm constantly shocked by the fact that, I thought this was something that we had left behind. I believe cultural progress is possible. I thought Western culture had largely learnt the lessons. Anti-Semitism, as Douglas Murray, a friend of mine, has often said, is a shape-shifting virus. When people were criticized, it constantly morphs. And I think we see anti-Semitism morphing into this virus that is left-wing and has done this sort of alliance of convenience with radical Islam in the West. It's not a good outcome.
Maybe this is the time to ask the influence on British youth from outside. So maybe do you know how much Europe is compromised by Qatar and China and Arab Saudi?
I mean,
by the way, in Israel, within Qatar, I will tell you something, it's not polite, I'm sorry, but in Israel we are saying Qatar is holding your government, England government, by balls. Sorry to say it, it's not polite, but this is how we are saying it. מחזיקים אותם בביצים. So,
I think we need to wake up to this. I'm not saying it is the decisive factor, but I think it's undoubtedly the case that foreign governments have, over the past 20 or 30 years, since the Cold War ended, foreign governments have learned that they can essentially infiltrate open Western societies. Now, we saw some fairly crass efforts at doing this with, for example, Colonel Gaddafi in Libya.
Yeah.
He rather clumsily tried to buy influence in British universities. China is clearly doing this in a more sophisticated way. Australia has had concerns about this. And we see China doing this. But I don't think China is the only player here. A country like Qatar clearly has...
I asked about China and Qatar specific. Yeah. So
I think we need to... I think it's fair to say that America has woken up to this problem. It would be very, very difficult, I think, for a company like I'm trying to remember the name of that Chinese telecom company that was trying to buy its way into Britain. But it would be very difficult for a company like Huawei. That's the one. It would be very difficult for Huawei to buy influence in America. I think it would be very difficult, increasingly difficult, for the Chinese government to buy its way into influence on American university campuses. I think America has woken up to this danger. I don't think Europe has. And I don't think Europe has woken up to the influence of certain wealthy Arab governments. Let's be clear. There seems to be something of a bit of a civil war going on in the Middle East between essentially the Shia versus Sunni, bluntly.
Of course.
And a historian might say what we're seeing here is the old post-Ottoman imperial boundaries being readjusted. And we see this in Syria, we see it in Yemen. You've got essentially Iran on one side with its proxies, the Saudis on the other with their proxies. But you've got a lot of notionally pro-Western governments like Qatar that are players in this, and they've got very, very deep pockets, and they may be very charming. They might invite your royal family to look at their horses. They might invite them to do sword dances. They might schmooze and charm your elites. They might get former ministers to sit on the boards of various companies. They might own a lot of property in London. But they are not naive. They are playing a dangerous geopolitical game, and we need to recognize that we can be friendly with them, but they're not our friends.
Do you know the 100 years plan of the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood? Did you heard about it? The 100 years plan?
Well, I read Syed Qutb's book Milestones, which is essentially an Islamist manifesto.
Yes. I will tell you why I'm asking, because of two reasons. One of them, okay, let's talk about the immigration in a second, but I want to ask you some interesting question. By the way, the way I see it, Christian Europe is surrendering to Islam. And this is, I see it in TikTok, I see it on news, I see it in interview, or on pictures. You can see it very easily. You can see Muslims smear the way they are talking in America and in Europe. It looks like they're Christian Europe is completely surrendering to Islam. And the only one who's standing up against Islam is 7 million Jewish who lives in Israel. So in a way, the way I see it, Israel not right now, but especially in the last 2 years, is standing in the front lines against Islam. So what is really, I really wonder about, okay? How come European leaders are not standing with us, helping us, and instead they're doing everything in the power to weaken Israel. And additionally to it, they are recognizing Palestinian state, which is madness.
There's quite a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think you're right. To use a very colloquial English expression, Israel I regard as the canary in the mine. In other words, a world in which Israel can thrive and prosper is a world in which my kids will do well, whether I'm in Mississippi or Manchester. A world in which Israel does not do well will be a grim world for the West. Now, your question is, why is it that the European elites don't understand the the issues? And here's the thing. When the Cold War ended, a certain outlook pervaded throughout Western society, and it's essentially this. It believed that the future of the world lay in a sort of secular, post-Christian rationalism. It was a world in which people could no longer attend church or only go on Christmas Day and not really pay too much attention to religious matters. The assumption was that the future lay with the Western world, post-Christian, secular, and that other countries and other civilizations would so obviously see the superiority of our way of life that they would embrace it. In fact, it wasn't really our way of life. We got it into our heads. We came to believe that the way we lived was the universal ideal, and that everyone would essentially aspire to what we had. The problem with this is that it betrayed an extraordinary ignorance of history and of the rest of the world. And as we now know, that if you create a secular society where people don't believe in anything, they will believe in everything. And you get the advance of what you might call post-religious religions, like the belief in climate change. You also create a spiritual vacuum into which Islam in the West is now stepping. And the British state and the British elites and the old school elites who believed in cultural relativism don't know how to handle it, because they're not used to the idea of people of faith and religious conviction. So I think the Western elites, particularly the European elites, are a victim of that old post-Cold War thinking. And what Israel and a few others have done is they live in the real world, and they recognize that actually, people who live in the various stans around the world, people who live on the other side of the border in the Middle East, are not waiting to adopt a Western way of life. They're not waiting to do MBAs at Harvard and create tech companies. They actually have a very different value system. They want very different things for their society and for their children and their grandchildren. And that if you don't adapt and change the way the West is run, particularly with its collapsing demographics, its unaffordable welfare system, you will actually find yourself essentially overtaken by a culture that you regarded as backwards. So I think you've got an intellectual division between the naive post-Cold War Western elites and those who see the world as it is, as most Israelis see it. The question is, can you wake up the Western elites fast enough for them to realize that actually borders matter, citizenship matters, birth rates matter, motherhood matters, fatherhood matters, saying that you have a Western way of life that is better than any other way of life and being prepared to fight and defend it matters. These are not atavistic old things from history. These are the things that will decide whether or not your children live in a free society or a society that practices Sharia law. We need to wake up in the West, get rid of that naive post-Cold War arrogance, and start to see the world as it is. Incidentally, you guys are ahead of us because you have to live alongside reality every day.
I agree.
The West is on a holiday from history, and history is coming back.
Holiday from history. I like it. Holiday from history.
And history is coming back with a vengeance, and it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah. I agree. So we cannot, okay, in order to understand the real problem of Europe, let's dig in a little bit more to the immigration problem. If I understood right, since the Brexit vote, England had like 6.5 more immigrants, if I'm remember right the number. So not only that the Brexit stopped it, how will I say, it opened the flow.
You had the Brexit vote, which was a vote about national self-determination, leaving the European Union and taking back control. Amongst things that people wanted to take back control of were control of the borders. You then had the COVID lockdown. And for a period of time, whatever you think about the COVID lockdown, and I was fiercely against the COVID lockdowns, but for whatever reasons, you had a period where there was no immigration. Countries literally shut their borders. What happened in Britain is that coming out of COVID, you had an orthodox opinion that was never stress tested by democracy, which basically said to get the economy to grow, we need to open the taps. We need to allow in, immigration is good for the economy. They naively said, let's allow people in. And what a disaster that was. They basically allowed in large numbers of people from India, from Pakistan, from the Middle East, from many countries that have little culturally in common with the West. People often on very low incomes. They lowered the amount of salary you needed to earn for a job in Britain to come in. So you're allowing in people on sort of 30, 40,000 pounds a year to come into Britain, which would automatically entitle them to welfare payments of various kinds and social housing and various other child tax credits and all the rest of it. They didn't even allow most people to come in to work. Actually, if you look at the data, most people who they allowed in came in as dependents of those on low-income jobs. So you allowed in people, you did three things. You allowed in very large numbers of people. 1 in 10 people in Britain today has arrived since 2017. Secondly, you allowed in people with very low skills who, contrary to myth, are not going to be the next tech entrepreneur. They'll be lucky if they manage to work in a car wash for the next 20 years. And then thirdly, you allowed in people from culturally incompatible countries. Allowing in people who have essentially a non-Western outlook presents a whole series of challenges. And so you're now in a situation where half the social housing, half the government-funded housing in London is occupied by people who are foreign. You have an $11 billion a year tax universal credit bill for foreigners. You have vast numbers of people who've come in the past 3 or 4 years who are not working but living on benefits. I mean, it is
welfare state for them.
It is literally we have allowed in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to come into Britain to live off benefits in Britain. It is a monumental act of stupidity. Now, this surge in immigration is because Boris Johnson was the idiot at the time, one of several idiots at the time who allowed this to happen. It's known as the Boris wave. But I think actually all three political parties, the Labour government, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Democrats, all of them own responsibility for the Boris wave. The question is, how can we stop it, and how can we then reverse it? Because we need to...
This is a very important question, but 1 second before you will answer it, do you think those immigrants came with the intent to replace the culture?
I don't know about that. I mean, I'm an immigrant talking to you from America, and I've come here and I sound like a Brit, and I'm too old to become American, and I will always essentially be British. But I integrate. I make sure that I sing the national anthem on a football Friday night as loudly as anyone. My daughter says the Pledge of Allegiance as fluently as anyone. I embrace American culture. I think it's possible for people to embrace the culture, but if they come from a culture that is non-Western, that has no concept of the individual the way that Western culture does, that doesn't have the default assumptions about freedom of speech and freedom of expression and diversity of opinion, even just academically, intellectually, the dialectic. I mean, I've given lots of lectures around the world. I can't help noticing that there's a particularly Anglo-American student mentality of the dialectic, where debate and discussion and disagreement is good. There's an assumption of that. Many students from many other cultures I've noticed, particularly from India and China, often sit there wanting to be told what to think. It's a very, very different... I'm not saying these are insurmountable problems, but they're there and they're difficult to bridge.
Yeah.
I don't think people necessarily come to another country and say, I'm going to colonize it. But that is the effect of what happens when, for example, large numbers of people from Pakistan move to Britain. They marry within their family, often cousin marriage. I think something like 60% of British Pakistanis are married to a first cousin. That creates a clannish mentality. It means that second and third generation, particularly women, often don't speak English properly. I mean, literally, they've lived in Britain all their lives and they do not speak the language. They culturally rotate and gravitate around essentially alien non-British institutions. That is not a recipe for integration. So, I don't want to be rude or unkind, but, when
we're in Israel, you can be rude and unkind.
Well, you essentially have to integrate. In England, the land of the English, you have to speak English, and you have to accept certain English norms and cultural mores, and that has to be insisted upon.
Yeah, and there is I think there are two other main reasons to take care of this phenomena. First of it, they are bringing more babies and you are not. And secondly, you don't need more than 5 or 10% of radical, let's talk about Islam, radical Muslims, in order to influence on the others. So even though most of them are very nice people, and I heard the interview you gave with this journalist, I don't know who he was, about the guy he met on the street, that he fixed his bicycle, and why he need to kick him up because he's a nice guy who know how to fix a bicycle. And then you said, okay, so our standard is to bring in everyone who knows to take care of a bicycle. So it's not an argument. I agree with you, by the way. But now it's fact. There are a lot of immigrants, in England and in Europe, and it's real dangerous for the economics and for the...
I mean, I think we need to draw certain lines. Okay. And I think one of the lines we need to draw very clearly is a fiscal benefit test. And I've published a proposal for a piece of legislation, which I'm pleased to see the Labour government is actually, having been accused of being an extremist a few weeks ago, I now see that the official British government is now embracing precisely the policy I was advocating. So thank you to all those left-wing columnists who demonized me. It's any time. The idea is that they would take a public benefit test. And if you were a foreign-born person living in Britain and you were living at public expense, I'm not talking about people who've worked and then retired, but working-age people. If you're living at public expense and you're a foreigner, you will be asked to leave. And I think that's one boundary we need to draw. Another boundary, and I think it's specific to Islam, and I think we should be prepared to ditch cultural relativism. This is the idea that if a boundary we need to draw is to do with religious liberty. I believe in religious liberty. I think one of the most...
In Israel, we have completely liberty.
And for me, one of the most impressive, I would almost call it the third founding document in America, is George Washington's letter to the Jewish congregation in Newport. I actually went, it was very moving. I went to the synagogue in Newport and filmed a little video there. And it's really touching to think that in 1791, the most powerful man in North America wrote a letter to the Jewish congregation in Newport saying, you're not going to be tolerated. You don't need to be tolerated. You're free to worship the way you want. No European leader would have written a letter like that at the time. It's really quite moving. Why do I talk about religious liberty? Because religious liberty doesn't mean turning a blind eye to radical Islamism. On the contrary, religious liberty means saying that you are not allowed in the West to advocate harm to people who give up their religion. Now, many of the mainstream, I think all of the mainstream schools of Islam say that if you abandon the faith, you should be harm should come to you. Often, actually, I think many schools of Islam say that the price of apostasy should be death. Now, I think we need to draw a line in the sand here and make it very clear that you cannot live in the West and advocate harm to what you might call apostates. Now, I know that here in America, and I'm guessing it's the same in Israel, if someone is a Christian and they give up their faith, that is a cause of great sadness, but no one would wish them harm. And I'm guessing that if you come from an Orthodox Jewish family in Israel and you decide you don't want to live the Orthodox way, you want to live the secular way, again, it would be a cause of sadness for people. They wouldn't wish you any harm. Now, we need to insist upon that norm amongst Muslims living in the West. You can religious liberty doesn't mean freedom to advocate harm to apostates. On the contrary, people should be free to abandon their faith. That is what religious liberty means. And we need to rediscover that Western idea of religious liberty and tolerance and apply it to some of what is happening in the streets and mosques and suburbs of Britain today.
Yeah, but still I didn't understand what is the practical solution. Okay, I understand that you draw lines, how they suppose in a way to behave and to be part of your culture. I mean the West culture. But still there will be people who won't be under this how will I say definition, under this definition.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a paper available online, serialized in the Telegraph, called Milestones. And I advocate some of the things Britain needs to do to revive and reform the country. And at the last section, I talk about the legislation that needs to be passed. You essentially need what I rather facetiously called Shamima's law. You need the ability to say to people with British passports who've been born in Britain, you have values that are incompatible with our way of life. We're going to strip you of your citizenship and we're going to remove you from the country. It'll be difficult, but I think you only need to do it if you're determined. You only need to do it on a relatively limited scale. Yeah. We were talking earlier about how a small number of very active, determined fanatics on one side can push everyone in a direction.
This is exactly what I said. Like you just need 5% or 10% to make this.
You only need to deport, I would say, a few thousand people, maybe starting with one or two imams in one or two mosques, and I think you could have an effect the other way. As a historian, I'm very, very struck by how often change happens, for good or ill, because of a small number of determined, motivated people. Famously, the catastrophe in Russia, where the Bolsheviks, who were never very numerous, took over. You could say the same thing in revolutionary France. You need to be very careful that you don't allow small numbers of radical extremists to push and push and push and say, well, not everyone agrees with them, it's going to be okay. No, it won't be okay.
No, it won't be okay.
Push back. You need to push back. You need
Because
to
most
push
of
back.
them are really crazy and nothing is really stopping them. So
Yeah.
they will push until they will succeed.
And you know, if everyone else is passive and everyone else is inert, and the British state is culturally and morally
Mhm.
relativistic,
Yeah.
and the British state primarily tries to do whatever it takes to have a quiet life, they will be bullied into doing some absurd thing. I mean, you're already beginning to see this when it comes to free speech.
Yeah.
Um, you know, in effect, in Britain today, and I'm not an expert on it,
Mhm.
I'm only going on what I've read in newspapers, but I read a newspaper article basically saying Britain today de facto has a blasphemy law, but it only applies to one religion. This is because a morally relativistic British state has been bullied into doing what it believes will create a quiet life for it. It won't be quiet, and it may not be a life for everyone.
You know what? It's remind me right now. There is a guy, I think his name is Tommy Robinson, and for many years, the government really hunted him and threw him to the behind the bar, and lately I saw him that he led a big march. And people, I don't know, it was like 1 or 2 million people follow him. So it looks to me like the citizen inside Britain and in Europe is really waking up, and they're not agree with the elites, and this is something that in a way make me happy
Yeah.
to
I
see
mean,
this
yeah,
change.
I'm not involved in any of that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not, I support people's right to protest and all of that. I'm not involved in all of that, but I'm not going to do the easy thing, which is to criticize people
Hmm.
who you know, support protesting these things, so long as it's done peacefully.
Yeah.
Um, I I think probably Britain's best bet is to fix this through Parliament and to do it peacefully. Um, and that means having a new government coming in, probably a Farage government, maybe a Conservative government under a new leader, maybe a combination of the two, having a conservative centre right, conservative slash reform centre right change of government. But for this to unfold and be resolved democratically and peacefully, it is contingent upon the judges and the civil servants
Hmm.
and the deep state, the administrative state,
Hmm.
to not try and obstruct it. And what I worry about is that, like in America under Trump 1, under Trump's first
Hmm.
term, you may see a sustained attempt by the chief constables, the College of Policing. We already know that the upper echelons of the British police are activist in this. We already know the judges are activist
Hmm.
in this. I worry that the British College of Policing and Britain's chief constables and the senior police officers in Britain, who I'm sure will get people to monitor what I'm saying to you now, I worry that they will behave in a very foolish way and try to thwart a democratically elected government in a few months or years down the line. And that does worry me. That then I think you do enter very, very dangerous territory. But you know, if any British officials are monitoring this, make sure that the people who've got you to monitor it don't try and subvert democracy, because I think that will end badly.
Yeah.
Um, and you need to embrace people like Nigel Farage and Robert Jenrick, because if the system doesn't bend to democratic pressure, it will break.
Hmm. Um, you know what one of the biggest fear Israelis have is to be isolated from the world because we're
Mm,
still very, very tiny country.
of course.
Even though we produce a lot and we have a lot of smart brain
Mm.
with a lot of invention, but from your perspective, how do you see the future relationship between Israel and Europe to the West?
I don't worry about
Regarding to the war, the time change.
I don't worry about Israel, and let me tell you why I don't worry about
Say
Israel.
it
I know
again,
that
say it again, say it again. I don't worry about, say it again.
I don't worry about Israel. And let me tell you why I don't worry about Israel. Israel might be a tiny little country with 7 million people surrounded by hostile states in the toughest neighborhood.
Yeah.
But there's a reason I don't worry about Israel, because of Israelis. Israelis have a sense of self-belief. They
Mm.
have a sense of purpose. When I visited Israel, I remember talking to young girls who are not much older than my daughter is now, who would go and join the army, who would do so willingly because it was their duty, who would have a seriousness of purpose, an earnestness about them that is entirely lacking in Western Europe. And it's Western Europe that I worry about, because although Western Europe might be further away from the hotspots, although it may have more missiles and planes today to protect it, although it may have safety in numbers, it doesn't have that seriousness of purpose, that earnestness. And that, I think, is what is so alarming and so worrying. Lloyd George, a former British Prime Minister, once gave a famous speech that I was recently rereading where he said he believed in small countries. And he came from a small country in Britain called Wales, which is a tiny, tiny country, which also happens to be roughly the same size as Israel. And he gave this wonderful speech saying it's small countries that actually are responsible for great things. And I think that's true, actually. I think the one exception to that being the United States, which is a collection of 50 small countries, 50 states, the United States. So don't feel despondent that you're small. The best countries in the world are small. The most productive countries in the world, from the Venetian Republic to the Dutch Republic to Britain, have been small. It's not the size of your population that matters. It's the purpose of your population, their sense of inner belief.
I like your answer so much. So it just popped to my mind. Last question. Do you think Russia will invade into Europe?
Goodness, I don't think
Took a deep breath, huh?
I take a very contrarian view on Russia. Okay, hear me out.
Okay.
I think the Russian problem is like the Ottoman problem. It is the weakness of Russia, the demographic collapse of Russia that is the problem. I know that today we sit here and we think about Russia and Ukraine, but long after that war is settled, I worry that the authorities in Moscow are not going to be able to hold and govern large swathes of territory that have been Russian-controlled for 150, 200 years. I think Russia's problem is a weakness problem, not a strength problem. The Ottomans were similar. The Ottomans once were a rapacious, aggressive power. And then the problem of the so-called Eastern question that British diplomats had to try and grapple with was, what do you do with an empire that is likely to implode? How do you and Britain spent a long time trying to make sure it didn't implode for various reasons. Not sure they called that one right. So I think that, yes, Russia is a problem in Ukraine. I think the West with resolve, and I'm pleased to see America being more supportive. I think the West, American-led, can win this. But my medium to long-term concern of Russia is the weakness. What happens hypothetically if some of Russia's neighbors were to decide they wanted a piece of Russia? What about those Middle Eastern, the Middle European, Middle Asian countries? I worry about Russian weakness, not Russian strength.
But what will you are saying, like, you are sure that the war will stop, but I don't see anything that can stop Putin right now. He doesn't care to continue with this war, even though you just mentioned his weakness, and I'm sure he's having a lot, like corruption, inside his military and his government. But you think, okay, it's supposed to be a very short answer if you have it. You think something will stop Putin?
He's got an economy the size of Spain, a demographic trajectory as awful as South Korea's. He may prevail in Ukraine this week or next week. I don't think he will long term. If I was sitting in Russia, I wouldn't just worry about Ukraine. I would worry about other countries claiming bits of the Far East. I would worry about separatist movements within Russia. I think what we're seeing is the spasm of a weak and failing power. It doesn't make it any less dangerous. But your question was, do I think Russia would invade Europe?
Yeah, I asked it, but then I add another question because I'm a woman. I like to ask a lot of questions.
Yeah. I think Russia is a malevolent influence. They're the wrong guys. They behaved appallingly in Ukraine. I wish Kiev would defeat them and drive them from its territory.
Yeah.
But longer term, my main concern, I think, would be with Russian weakness, not Russian strength. But, weak countries can be you could say that, the weakness of Germany was one of the reasons for the First and Second World War, or Germans' fear of their weakness. The fact that a country is feeling weak doesn't make it any less dangerous. In fact, it can make it more dangerous.
Exactly. This is exactly what I wanted to say. I agree with you, by the way. Okay, so first of all, when was the last time you've been in Israel?
Gosh, 6 years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago.
5 years?
5 or 6 years ago, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now it's already dark outside, so you don't see. But behind me, I don't know, when we started the interview, it's Golan Heights and Syria. And
so you're near Lake Galilee?
Exactly. I'm watching it from my window.
Okay.
And I'm invited you to Israel and to show you around.
I'd love to come.
Yes.
I've had... before I got married in my 20s, I had some very fun evenings out in Tel Aviv. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful place to go to. I'd love to. Yeah, let me know.
Okay, the north is completely different from Tel Aviv, so it's completely different experience. But you are this is an open invitation. And do you have something to say to the Israeli audience before we are leaving? Before we are ending? Sorry.
You have friends. Don't forget it. I'm a huge. I've always been a long-term admirer of Israel ever since I was 6 years old, just outside Entebbe. Israel is not perfect. No country is, but you have friends, and all the best.
Thank you, Douglas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. זהו, הסתיים הפרק. כמו שאמרתי בתחילתו, מי שרוצה להמשיך ולנהל דיונים על אקטואליה וכל מיני נושאים שעולים במהלך היום-יום, יש לנו ערוץ טלגרם פעיל. ומי שרוצה לקבל תכנים אקסקלוסיביים, מוזמן להצטרף למועדון החברים. כמובן, אם אתם מקשיבים באפליקציות, תסמנו לנו 5 כוכבים ותצטרפו לערוץ. אנחנו נתראה בפרק הבא.